This show, Deal Hudson, about a subject we all want to know more about, happiness. Please join us. Before Deal Hudson came to Crisis Magazine as publisher and editor, he was a philosophy professor at Mercer University, Fordham, and New York University. And one of his favorite subjects was the subject of happiness, looking at that from a philosophical perspective. And actually, Deal, you wrote a book on the subject of happiness called Happiness and the Limits of Satisfaction. What got you interested in the first place in the subject of happiness as a philosopher?
Well, Zoe, you know, we're all interested in happiness in one way or another, but I was reading Aristotle really for the first time. It was during my first year or two as a professor of philosophy in Atlanta at Mercer University, which is a Baptist college. And this, I still hadn't become a Catholic yet. I was a year or two away from my conversion, and I was reading Aristotle's Ethics, and I noticed that he described happiness in terms of a whole life, and especially the moral attainment of an entire life, that a person could not be called happy unless he had been morally good, and that you really don't know if you have a happy life until you're at the end of the life, because certain things can happen to you, certain bad luck, or you can lose your virtue, and you would lose your happiness. And I thought, this is totally different from the way we're using the word happiness now, which is just a feeling state or psychological satisfaction, some sort of pleasure. And I got very interested in how did we get from Aristotle to the idea that happiness required moral virtue to where we are today, where happiness really has nothing to do with virtue. And in a lot of people's minds, virtue gets in the way of pleasure and gets in the way of what happiness seems to be.
Well, I want to talk about how we got from then to now, but let's talk about, I mean, we all want to be happy. We all want more happiness, but I suspect that, of course, today's definition of happiness is not obviously what Aristotle had in mind. It is a very psychological understanding of happiness and feeling state. What is the world's definition right now, would you say, of happiness?
I'd say most people believe happiness to be a state of positive emotion or positive mood or satisfaction. You know, it has to be positive. That is, it has to be enjoyable or pleasurable, at least not to detract, pull down, or in any way get in the way of daily life. And what's wrong with that is very simple. That people use the word happy and happiness, or those words, to justify their most important decisions in life. I mean, obviously the little decisions are justified that way, but the really big ones, I mean, you commonly hear people say, oh, I married her because she makes me happy, or I took this job and left that job because it's going to make me happy, or I got out of that marriage because I was unhappy, or we're not going to have children, or we're going to have children, or we're going to adopt or not to adopt. And it all revolves around the word happiness. So happiness really is the fulcrum of moral decision making in everybody's life.
So we've taken this word happiness and we have used it to mean pleasurable.
Right. And I thought to myself, now wait a minute. What's happening here is that the ancient notion that happiness is a moral term is still being used, but it's been substituted for a pleasure state, which means that all these important decisions in life, all these crucial determinative decisions in life, are revolving around states of pleasure, states of psychological satisfaction and mood. And I thought to myself, there is no way that any reasonable person with any kind of moral earnestness wants their life to be determined by accruing states of pleasure or accruing psychological satisfaction, because that just leads to what I call pig happiness. In fact, John Stuart Mill, in his book Utilitarianism, actually saw this coming. We talked about pig happiness, where he said, better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig.
Well, and we see that today. We see happiness and how our concept of happiness relates to materialism, relates to probably relativism,
Eroticism.
Right. Also depression and apathy.
Right. Because people who constantly chase after pleasure and chase after positive moods can't possibly maintain them all the time. I think this is why we have such a drug culture. Because where you have basically said that the end of human existence, the summum bonum, what the ancients called the highest good, is feeling good or maintaining a positive mood or a positive self-esteem. The only way to really maintain that 24 hours a day is through shooting something in your arm or taking a pill, because, I mean, all kind of things happen to a person during a day to bring us down. And also there's such a thing called sin, and there's such a thing called physical illness and catastrophe and bad weather and stubbing your toe and so forth. And if happiness is really what people think it is, then it's impossible to keep it except through artificial means. And then once you go off that drug, whatever it is, you're facing this incredible emptiness.
So is there an objectively true definition of happiness?
I'm not sure that there's a definition. There certainly is an objectively true or reliable description.
Then what would
and I think, well, let me tell you how I would get there. I think what's important is that our viewers understand that happiness or a happy life is simply that aim of life, or that end of life that all human beings by their very nature desire. So to be happy is something we can't help. You can't snuff that out. I mean, it's just your
common to all.
Right. It's your dilemma and it's my dilemma. There's no way to go to the source and sort of turn the faucet off. We're always looking for that. And that desire for happiness actually gets us in trouble because we're always looking for happiness in all the wrong places, as the cowboy song goes. And so we have to learn how to make the right decisions about it. And those decisions are, by their very nature, moral decisions. So a person who is morally virtuous has, as it were, qualified for the possibility of happiness. Because you're not going to make the right decisions about the search for happiness unless you have virtue guiding you. So virtue becomes a necessary prerequisite to living a happy life. Virtue is precisely what keeps you from chasing pleasure. It's what keeps you from chasing satisfaction, self-satisfaction in the place of real accomplishment. Because here's what happens. It leads to this idea that what's important above all else, that I be satisfied with myself, leads us into plain self-deception. Because that means when you make a mistake and you're facing this dark night of guilt and remorse and dissatisfaction, it means you have to invent some explanation to look good to yourself.
But pleasure and satisfaction are part of happiness, aren't they?
Yes, but only on the side of the unexpected result. It's not what you intend. What you intend is to live a morally good life. You hope for some good luck, some of God's grace. And satisfaction and pleasure are the things you get after you have positive accomplishments. So satisfaction and pleasure, the kind of satisfaction and pleasure that are integral to a truly happy life, are those that are the consequence of attaining what's good for you. You don't, for example, kiss your husband or your wife, do you? You're now married, so you have a husband, you can relate to this, in the hopes of getting pleasure out of it. I mean, you kiss them because you love them. And you want to show them something. Right. And you, what? Oh, it's pleasurable. What? That's nice too.
But then that's part of the motivation to do it again.
Yeah, but still, if it becomes the sole motivation for doing it, then you obviously got your priorities wrong. So you don't, for example, give money to the poor in order to get pleasure for it. You obviously don't courageously witness to the truth in an alien culture in order to get pleasure from it, because first of all, you're not going to get a lot of pleasure from it when everybody starts criticizing you and calling you names and attacking you.
So happiness is related to the seeking of the good,
Right.
without necessarily having the resulting
No, in fact, you
pleasure
may,
or satisfaction.
you
of
may
course.
get suffering. In fact, suffering is very likely. I mean, anybody who tries to live well and kind of in a fallen world is going to suffer a great deal. I mean, we will look at our Lord Jesus Christ, who was crucified. We will look at all the apostles who suffered, the history of Christian martyrs. I mean, the idea that a Christian of any kind would see happiness as a kind of uninterrupted state of pleasure, exalted mood, or personal satisfaction has obviously never meditated very long on the life of Christ or on the history of the church.
But a lot of people would find it hard to believe that you can be happy while also suffering.
But you can.
Be,
you can.
Right?
In fact, even the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome knew that. Socrates, for example, was happy when he drank the hemlock because he was doing the right thing. He died a happy man. Mm-hmm. He says so. I mean, and other people would praise him for precisely that. There was a debate that went on for a couple of centuries in the ancient world about whether or not a virtuous man who was being roasted alive could be called happy while he was being roasted alive. In other words, take away all of his pleasure, satisfaction, but leave his virtue as to can you still call him happy. Now that's a kind of dramatic, extreme case of the situation, but most philosophers agreed, yes, you could call him happy, because to call somebody happy was the greatest tribute you could pay to a human being. Why would you pay tribute to a person with no virtue?
Let's talk more about that after the break. Please join us. We'll be right back with Dale Hudson talking about happiness. I'm Zoe Romanowsky, and I'm talking to Dr. Dale Hudson about the subject of happiness. Dale, we were talking about suffering and happiness. What role does suffering play in attaining happiness or being happy?
I think there are two basic issues. First, you have to be able to handle it. You have to be able to integrate it. You can't assume that the presence of suffering defeats the happy life, because suffering comes to people who try to live well. It comes to people who espouse causes, who are passionate about trying to do the right thing. Especially it comes to Christians who, share the cross of Christ. The second way it comes to you is that it sometimes can be a sign that you're on the right path. Mm-hmm. And this is where the Christian or in Catholic view of happiness is so very different from the modern secular one. In the secular view, you're only on the path to happiness if you're feeling good. In the Catholic view, it may be that it's a dark night of the soul, deep remorse and guilt. The experience of penance means you're on the right path to the final or true object of happiness, which is, of course, love of God.
Well, just looking at the lives of the saints, I mean, many of the saints were, we could say, the happiest people we know, that we've heard of, and yet many of them suffered so greatly.
Yeah, and you see, a lot of people confuse joy with happiness. And
What's the difference?
well,
between
joy is the awareness that you are, psychological awareness that you are united with what you really love and what's really valuable. It's a kind of positive state. But again, it's a mistake to think of joy itself as what we seek, because that's like saying it's not so important that I cleave to God, but that I experience the joy of cleaving to God, which again gets the cart in front of the horse.
I think of the Beatitudes, and often, depending on what translation you're reading, it says, happy are the peacemakers and happy the meek. Some translations say blessed.
Well, blessed is the right translation, because
Okay.
it's the Greek makarios. And there is an important distinction to be made between blessedness and happiness, but there's also an important unity. The unity is that in the Christian universe, no one's really going to attain happiness. It's very unlikely you'll attain a morally good life or ever to meet God face to face without grace. I mean, obviously you're not going to meet God face to face without grace. Whether a person can live a morally good life without grace, I think is highly unlikely, although theoretically possible. I think that, so makarios, or blessedness, stands for what you're given, and eudaimon, or happiness in the Greek, is what you attain in the course of your life.
Do you have to be a person of faith, do you think, and particularly Christian faith, to be happy?
I think it helps. I think it helps so much that I'd not want to go it alone without knowing revelation, without the help of God's grace. I think the pagan philosophers are a great example of people who try to do it based upon reason and based upon experience. And their writings on the subject, especially those of the Stoic school and some of the Epicurean school, are quite profound and quite helpful. But you can just see how much they wanted help, but they didn't believe in the possibility of help, so they didn't get it.
Now you mentioned Aristotle, reading his writings on happiness got you interested in the subject. Give us a brief overview historically of what the definition of happiness was at the different periods of time up until now.
It's really a pretty simple overview, Zoe. In the ancient world, happiness was more or less equal to living a morally good life. Some people included other things like worldly success or good luck, and others didn't. But generally speaking, it all revolved around living a morally good life in this world. In the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, when that concept was Christianized, the morally good life was then identified with life with God in heaven and cleaving to God and being cleaved in love in that relationship. And happiness in this world was not really discussed or thought of very much, some, but a little bit. In the Renaissance, the whole idea of happiness, crashed back down to earth, and the philosophers and theologians of that time began to speculate once again on what happiness in this life was. And again, even at that time, they still had a virtue-centered notion of happiness, although with the explosion of the middle class and of democratic thinking and the importance of the individual, there was a lot more added about worldly goods and worldly success and so forth. And so you really were back to where the Romans were in thinking about happiness. And then a very, very important thing happened. The idea that the essence of happiness was the experience of pleasure began to take hold again in European thinking. And the importance of the pursuit of pleasure, it gradually evolved into what we now call utilitarianism. But utilitarianism was not just isolated to the work of Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill. It was throughout the Renaissance in Scotland and France and Italy and other places. And so the idea that human beings were made not to love and see God, not to live a morally good life regardless of suffering and consequences, but the idea that human beings were owed happiness in terms of enjoying life and having pleasure really revolutionized the idea of happiness and got mixed up in politics. Because the first article of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution is that every human being has a right to happiness, which really translated into every human being has a right to enjoy their life, which means that the state must somehow supply that for them, which becomes very odd, because how can a state, ensure that an individual enjoys their own life? So you can see that the idea of happiness was destined to become manipulated in the hands of totalitarian dictators like Stalin and Mao and Hitler and other bad guys in history, who really did try to promise their people an enjoyable life and bring it about through the use of total power over individual lives.
So to some extent, happiness has been defined culturally and historically differently through different time periods. And so would you say that there is a specific time where it was closer to what's objectively true happiness?
I think Aquinas got it exactly right, where he said that eternal happiness, the full summum bonum of man, the end we all seek, is loving and knowing God. But he talked about an imperfect happiness in this world, which is a reflection, an analogy of that eternal happiness, which requires a moral goodness, requires virtue, but also requires some of the basic goods of life to be present. Aquinas was like Aristotle. He said that virtue alone does not mean a person can be called happy. They have to have some of life's goods, because there are other things in life that human beings naturally desire, and virtue is, not enough. But I don't really want to go to, because I don't want to complicate the matter, but I want to say that I still go back to Aquinas for my basic framework to understand eternal happiness and then temporal happiness, which he called imperfect happiness.
We have a few minutes left. I want to get practical for a minute and talk about how an individual in today's culture can attain true happiness. What can we do to change our idea of it?
I think the most important thing is to get off of this ridiculous pleasure treadmill and this ridiculous self-esteem and self-satisfaction treadmill, and realize that suffering and sort of negative experiences are all part of life, and a necessary and sometimes very good part of life, because they're integral to trying to live a morally serious life. They're certainly integral to living a Christian life. And again, just meditate on the Passion of Christ and the history of the Church shows you that to be the bearer of gospel values in the present world is going to bring you a lot of hostility and a lot of attacks and a lot of disappointments. But you will know joy on the other side. But to call a life like that happy is to recognize that someone's on the right path, toward the right end, taking whatever hits they're going to take on that road, accepting them, offering them up to God, and knowing that ultimately, he or she will see God face to face. So first, they've got to have the right expectations about pleasure and pain in this life. It's not all smiles, it's not all instant uplift. It's sometimes dark.
So change expectations, recapture maybe the meaning of suffering in our lives.
Yes. Identify with Christ in that matter. And then finally realize that there's going to be, no one should call you happy, and you should call no one happy unless they're a morally good person, or at least intending to try to live that way.
And how do we promote this in a post-Christian, in many ways, society?
Well,
people
first
who
of
aren't
all,
going to meditate on the Passion of Christ.
First of all, we listen to people and we challenge them. When they say such and such makes them happy, we should challenge them and say, what kind of happiness are you talking about? Feeling good? And then if they say yes, she says, well, you think this will make you feel good a year from now? Or what happens if 6 months from now you feel bad about this? Are you going to make another decision, go in another direction? You try to show them through dialectic, conversation, or whatever discussion, that to base a decision on these kind of shallow criteria will only lead them into a kind of confusion which will ultimately be bad for their lives, which will lead them to final unhappiness.
Is Deal Hudson happy?
I'm on my way, thanks to friends like you and my family and the grace of God.
Well, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to sit in your seat and talk to you about the subject of happiness, something we all seek more of and we all need to be enlightened about. And I have been from this conversation.
Okay, I think as a married lady, you make a much better interviewer.
And to all of you who've been with us today, thank you. We wish all of you much happiness. Thanks for being with us.